In 1906, a tugboat appeared off Point Loma near San Diego, towing what witnesses described as a giant whale. It was a cigar-shaped mass of chained log, 600 feet long, that had just travelled 1,100 miles through the open Pacific from Oregon. The man who built it was a Norwegian immigrant who arrived in America broke. Everyone said floating timber through the ocean was suicide. He did it 120 times. Simon Benson was born in 1851 in the mountain valley of Gausdal, Norway, where winters stretched long and the land offered little promise to a poor family. He grew up with 6 siblings in a log house his father built by hand, surrounded by forests that seemed endless but gave little comfort against hunger. When Benson was 16, his family packed their lives into a few battered trunks and sailed for America. They landed in Wisconsin in 1867, strangers to the language, the customs, and the vast, wild country that would shape their fortunes. In those first years, every day meant hard labour. Benson worked as a farmhand, rising before dawn and toiling until night for barely enough to feed himself. He learned English by candlelight, hoping for a better job in the sawmills that lined the Wisconsin rivers. By the time he turned 24, he had scraped together enough to open a general store in the small town of Lynxville. For a while, it seemed like the struggle might finally end. The store prospered. He married and welcomed a son. There was pride in building something from nothing, in finally having a roof that felt secure. But in 1878, disaster struck. A fire swept through Lynxville and reduced Benson's store and his hopes to ashes. In a single night, he lost everything he owned. The insurance was worthless. He was left with debts, a wife, and an infant to support, facing the kind of ruin that could break a man for good. Benson later said that the memory of those losses never left him. It drove him to take risks others shunned, to trust his own judgment when the world laughed or doubted. He was 27, broke, and starting again from nothing. The fire in Lynxville forced Benson to look west. The timberlands of Oregon were drawing thousands with the promise of new beginnings. In 1879, he gathered his family and boarded a train bound for Portland, carrying little more than determination and the lessons of hardship burned into him. The forests of the Pacific Northwest were thick and untamed, but to Benson, they held a different kind of possibility, a chance to reinvent himself, to build something that would last. Out of adversity, he found the nerve to gamble on ideas others dismissed as foolish, and the stubbornness to see them through. In Portland, Simon Benson wasted no time. The city was booming, and timber was the gold of the Northwest. Benson started with a single claim near St. Helens, but he saw farther than most. While others scraped by with what they could haul out on muddy roads, Benson bought up failed homesteads along the lower Columbia, piece by piece, until he held nearly 46,000 acres of forest, an empire built out of land no one else wanted. He poured every dollar back into the business. Where his rivals relied on teams of oxen and muscle, Benson ordered steel rails and locomotives. In 1891, he spent $6,000, an immense sum, on seed iron for his own logging railroad, snaking tracks deep into the woods where wagons could never reach. Steam donkey engines replaced horses and men, dragging logs out of ravines and over ridges with a whistle and a roar. Each machine and each mile of track multiplied the power of a single crew. Timber that once took weeks to move now reached the river in hours. The Columbia itself became Benson's private highway. He set up camps at Clatskanie, Oak Point, and across the water in Washington, always looking for the next stand of fir or cedar. His crews felled trees by the thousands, sending them crashing into the mud, then winched them out and loaded them onto rail cars. Barges and scows ferried the logs downstream. By the turn of the century, Benson's holdings stretched as far as the eye could see, forests, rail lines, and rivers all working in concert under his direction. But Benson's ambitions did not stop at the water's edge. The markets that paid best were hundreds of miles south, in California, where the price of lumber soared and the cost of shipping by rail ate up nearly every profit. Benson saw the bottleneck and he refused to accept it. He was now the wealthiest lumberman in Portland, recognized for his relentless drive and willingness to gamble on ideas that seemed outlandish. With the capital and land under his control, he could afford to experiment where others hesitated. He began to ask a question that sounded like madness. Could entire forests be chained together and sent down the open Pacific, not as cargo, but as a single floating raft? This was the world Benson built for himself, one where risk was measured in miles of track and acres of timber, and where fortune favoured the man who dared to think bigger than the riverbanks. The stage was set for a new kind of engineering challenge, one that would test the limits of wood, steel, and human nerve. Long before Simon Benson's first raft touched the Pacific, the ocean had already claimed its share of lumbermen's dreams. In the 1880s, Captain Hugh Robertson of New Brunswick set out to solve a riddle that stumped both engineers and seafarers. Could you bind a forest together and tow it, whole, across open sea? Robertson's answer was a patent filed in 1886 for a cigar-shaped raft, logs lashed tight around a central steel chain, braced by wrist-thick iron bands every dozen feet. The idea looked elegant onto paper. In practice, it was a gamble with the Atlantic's moods. Robertson's early rafts sometimes fell apart or vanished altogether. One drifted all the way to West Africa, a ghost ship of timber lost to the tides. But in 1888, after years of tinkering, he managed a successful run to New York, bringing in enough wood to fill 40 schooners. He became a minor celebrity, and lumbermen on both coasts took notice. The Pacific, though, was a different beast. In 1892, the Fort Bragg Lumber Company in California hired Robertson to build the West's first cigar raft, hoping to slash shipping costs by 80%. The raft stretched 365 feet, longer than a city block, and packed 1.2 million board feet of redwood into a floating colossus. Chains wrapped every 12 feet, a pilot house perched on top, and coloured lights blinked at either end. But as the raft left the harbour, it struck a rock and broke up almost instantly, the logs scattered, bobbing helplessly in the surf. The loss was public and too expensive, a warning to anyone who thought the ocean could be tamed by clever rigging alone. Bend, a German-born engineer, watched and learned. In the mid-1890s, he tried his own hand at ocean rafting, building prototypes for Pacific lumber outfits. His first raft in 1894 didn't last 30 miles offshore before the chain snapped and the whole mass unravelled into the shipping lanes. The next year he tried again, tightening the chains and adjusting the log layout. That raft barely survived the journey, limping into port battered but intact. Bend understood what the others missed. The Pacific's swells twisted and flexed a raft in ways no river or bay could match. It wasn't enough to build big, you had to build smart or not at all. By the turn of the century, these failures had become cautionary tales. Investors were wary, and most loggers laughed off the idea of ocean rafts as a fool's errand. But Simon Benson saw something else in the wreckage, a set of problems that, if solved, could open a new empire. In 1904, after years of watching from the sidelines, Benson made his move. He recruited Bend, the only man who had come close to beating the Pacific at its own game. Together they set out to design a raft that could survive the open ocean, not just in theory, but in the teeth of the real thing. The lessons of lost rafts, Robertson's bold patent, Fort Bragg's shattered hopes, and Bend's near misses became the blueprint for a new approach. This time the stakes were higher, but so was the promise to turn the impossible into routine and to silence the skeptics once and for all. At Wallace Slough, the plan that loggers once mocked took on real weight and shape. The site, tucked into a bend of the lower Columbia, became a hive of methodical labour and relentless invention. John Bend, the engineer Benson trusted above all others, directed the work with a precision born from hard lessons at sea. Every raft began in a floating wooden cradle, a frame as long as the 3 city blocks and as wide as a country lane. Over 4 to 7 weeks, crews stacked logs, sometimes whole trees layer by layer, each one chosen for length and straightness that are fitted to the next like bones in a giant's spine. A floating derrick swung the logs into place, its cables creaking under the weight. As the raft grew, workers threaded massive chains through the pile, not just around the outside but laced in a herringbone pattern deep within. One chain ran the full length of the raft, anchoring the core, and others wrapped every 15 or 20 feet, binding the logs into a single flexible mass. The chains themselves weighed up to 250 tons, more than a locomotive, and every link had to hold against the violence of the Pacific swells. Ben's genius was in the details. He insisted on a pattern of interlocking chains that could flex with the waves but pull tighter when the raft was under strain. The logs were not just stacked, they were cinched and cross-braced, the tension distributed from end to end. As the last logs went in, a donkey engine wound the chains taut, squeezing the whole assembly until it creaked. Then came the moment of truth. Workers unbolted one side of the cradle, and the raft, now 1,000 feet long and 55 feet wide, slid free into the water. This kick-out was more than a launch. It was a test of everything they had built. The raft flattened and settled, its chains tightening under the weight and pressure, locking the logs into their final shape. Water forced the mass together, squeezing out slack and making the raft stronger than when it left the cradle. The finished rafts dwarfed anything seen before on the river. Each held between 4 and 6 million board feet of timber, enough to frame hundreds of houses, yet floated high and steady, drawing 26 to 28 feet. The chains, now hidden beneath the surface, kept every log in line, ready to face the open ocean. Benson watched these launches with a gambler's calm. He had staked his fortune and reputation on a design that most men called folly. But at Wallace Slough, the impossible became routine. Every raft that survived the kick-out was a silent answer to the doubters, a floating promise that the Pacific might yet be tamed by iron and willpower. The next challenge waited beyond the bar, where the real test, towing this mountain of timber down 1,000 miles of open sea, would begin. Tugboat whistles echoed across the Columbia as the first ocean raft nosed toward the bar, a 1,000-foot tangle of logs, chains, and human hope. The crew aboard the lead tug knew every crossing here was a gamble. The Columbia River Bar, where river meets open Pacific, was called the graveyard of the Pacific for good reason. Currents collided, fog rolled in without warning, and sandbars shifted beneath the surface. A single mistake could scatter 6 million board feet of timber across the surf, undoing months of labour in minutes. But the crew pressed on, threading the massive raft through the breakers. The chains groaned under strain, and deckhands kept a wary eye on every link. About half the rafts carried extra cargo, posts, poles, and shingles stacked high above the waterliner, lashed down for the long haul south. Once clear of the bar, the real journey began. The route stretched 1,100 miles down the Pacific coast, a voyage that would last 15 days if luck held and weather cooperated. Each day at sea brought new risks. Swells battered the raft, flexing the chains and testing Ben's design. Tug crews worked in shifts, always alert for signs of trouble, a parting cable, a shifting load, a storm on the horizon. Nights were spent listening to the wind and the creak of timber, knowing there was no turning back. For the men aboard, every mile south was a small victory over doubt and disaster. At the end of the line waited San Diego, where Benson's new sawmill stood on the bayfront, just south of where the convention center rises today. As the first rafts arrived, the city's skyline began to change. Lumber poured from the water's edge into a frenzy of building. In just 4 years, local construction doubled, fueled by cheap, steady timber from the north. What began as a wild bet now powered the growth of a city, and the laughter of skeptics was drowned out by the sound of saws and hammers. In the years that followed the first triumphant landings in San Diego, the impossible became routine. Benson and Ben's operation launched nearly 120 ocean rafts, each one a floating forest chained tight and towed down the Pacific. Rafts as long as a city block, some holding 6 million board feet of timber, crossed 1,100 miles of open water with a success rate that stunned the industry. Out of more than 600 million board feet sent south, only a handful of rafts were lost. For 35 years, the Pacific gave up its doubts, and the laughter faded to respect. But the ocean never gave up its danger. In November 1926, tragedy struck at the mouth of the Columbia. The tug Bahadur, guiding one of Benson's rafts across the bar, exploded in the night. 9 men lost their lives in the chaos. Crew who had faced fog, currents, and the threat of disaster on every crossing. Their loss was a sober reminder that no amount of engineering could tame the sea completely. Still, the work went on. Faster Bend oversaw construction into his late 60s, and the rafts kept coming year after year. The end arrived not with a storm, but with fire. In August 1941, Raft 120, the final raft, caught fire off the coast of Monterey. Wet logs should not have burned, but the blaze raged for 2 days, breaking the raft apart and sending its cargo to the bottom. Insurance companies pulled out, rumours swirled of sabotage, and the era of ocean rafts was over. Benson had already cashed out by then, selling his timber empire in 1910 for $4.5 million. He turned his fortune to public good. In 1912, he donated $10,000 for bronze drinking fountains called Benson Bubblers, so Portlanders could drink water instead of whiskey. He gave $100,000 to establish Benson Polytechnic School, built the Benson Hotel, and donated 1,000 acres at Multnomah Falls for parks and public roads. The man who once gambled everything on impossible rafts became a builder of schools, parks, and fountains. His name carried on every time a child filled a cup at the corner, or a family stood in the spray at the falls. For all the timber that crossed the ocean, this is what endured. A penniless immigrant chained 6 million board feet into a floating gamble and dared the Pacific to break him. The ocean nearly did. Fires and wrecks still haunt the story. Yet Benson's real legacy isn't fortune, but the schools, parks, and fountains that bear his name. In a world still quick to dismiss the impossible, his audacity endures. What bold idea are we laughing at today?